Now it's on.
Ready? Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this really important seminar. We are going to record it, so people who can't make it today will be able to get access to it. I'm Leslie London. I'm in the School of Public Health at the University of Cape Town in the Division of Public Health Medicine. I'm a medical doctor who trained in public health. And our speaker today is also a family physician from Canada who was also training in public health and who was targeted for his views speaking out for human rights in Palestine while he was in a public health training program. So I was shocked to actually find out that such things could happen, but it actually reminds us of what happened in South Africa many years ago. We know that during apartheid, if you were a health activist, you risked being victimized and targeted for doing things like defending human rights, like speaking out for human rights. And in fact, we're in a room that's named after a professor of neurology, Frances Ames. Some of you won't know this, but she was a professor who went to great personal risk to speak up against the torture and killing of Steve Biko, a human rights activist in South Africa. When the health professions, the then Medical and Dental Council, refused to do anything about the human rights abuses, much like many of our medical professional bodies around the world are refusing to speak up about Palestine. She took the council to court. She mortgaged her house. She was a single mother with 3 young children, and she risked all that to stand up for human rights, despite the fact that her colleagues told her to keep quiet because UCT wouldn't get any research funding. Luckily, she didn't keep quiet, and eventually the court case was found in her favor, and there was action taken over the death of Steve Biko. So I think we have role models in public health who do things where they stand up for human rights, and that's why we were really pleased that Dr. Yipeng agreed to do this seminar with us, and I'm very pleased to meet you online at last. Just by way of introduction, you have Yipeng has a background in family medicine. He's a trainee, a resident, as they call it, in public health in Canada. He has an MPH from Harvard, and I think you were on the Canadian Medical Association, or Canadian Public Health Association, until action was taken against you. So you've spent a lot of time working in different contexts for population health, and have been very active in population health, but also in defense of Palestinian rights. So we're really looking forward to hearing from you talk today about solidarity on the front line while taking on anti-Palestinian racism matters. I'm going to hand over to Feroza just to say a few words from Healthcare Workers for Palestine and the Division of Public Health, and hereby give you this amazing.
Thank you. Okay, so let's just. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone that's here and online. Thank you so much for joining us. So I think before Dr. Gerg gives his tells his story, I thought it would be useful to actually just provide some context as to why all of this is happening and what we need to do. So here goes. I think the important thing to remember is that the issue between Palestine and Israel did not start on the 7th of October. And there is a very long history dating back to 1878 where all of this began, right? And so I'm also just giving a very quick introduction. So just a disclaimer on this. I'm not going into detail about medical apartheid and exactly what's happening in terms of the public health crisis in Palestine. Dr. Emma Kieran did cover that last week. Right? And also one announcement that I forgot to make when I started is that we will be taking photos, but when we post those photos online, we will blur everyone's faces out. Right? along with the context of this having started many decades ago, not sharing. Okay. No problem. Sorry, just some technical difficulties. Yes. Okay, there we go. So, along with that long history is a history of medical apartheid before October the 7th, right? With the Israeli occupation through the Israeli Ministry of Health had complete oversight and control over pharmaceuticals imported to the occupied Palestinian territories. And this led to health inequities. So Palestinians were subjected to inferior health care through restricted access to medication and medical equipment. The blockade itself impeded access to care. I mean, it's quite evident that occupation is a public health issue, and that's one of the reasons why we need to care. And there have been attacks on the health system documented by the World Health Organization of pre-October the 7th. And pre-October the 7th, as a healthcare worker community, we have largely remained silent. Since October the 7th, these attacks on the healthcare system in Palestine have significantly increased to a point where the public health system has collapsed. Right? And this particular clipping about a WHO statement that warns Gaza's health system was at breaking point was made, what's the date? October the 13th last year. That was just a few days after the initial 7th of October attack. So you can imagine where we're sitting at now. So I think we're at a point where we can no longer remain silent. This is why. First reason, as healthcare workers, we have a duty to be advocates for healthcare, right? And now in South Africa in particular, we have the Health Professions Council of South Africa that has mandated a number of competencies that healthcare professionals in South Africa have to actually graduate with. And as you can see, being a health advocate is actually one of them. That's competency number 5. So the document states, as health advocates, healthcare professionals should responsibly use their expertise and influence to advance the health and well-being of individuals, communities, and populations. And the enabling competency is to apply the ethical and professional principles inherent in health advocacy, including altruism, social justice, autonomy, integrity, and idealism. Right? So this is now actually largely being seen and entrenched as part of our identities as healthcare workers, as well as part of our role as healthcare workers, which is to fight for health justice. Healthcare is not a weapon. And what Israel has done, it has used the healthcare system in its arsenal of weaponry to commit a genocide in Palestine, and systematically and intentionally destroying the healthcare system. International humanitarian law protects healthcare workers and health infrastructure in conflict zones, right? But Israel has consistently violated this pre-October the 7th, post-October the 7th, by targeting healthcare workers, killing them, kidnapping them, torturing them, destroying hospitals, destroying ambulances, right? And targeting non-combatants like women and children. So they've used the health system to commit a genocide. The public health system has essentially collapsed. There's almost nothing that they can use to cure those who have been injured, and there's no access to acute and chronic care, right? And this alone renders life unsustainable in Palestine. This is an act of genocide. They've also targeted the social determinants of health, right? And in so doing, have also rendered the place unsustainable for living. They are also committing genocide by preventing births. So 70% of those killed are women and children, and there's no access to maternal and child health services, and this is crucial for the long-term survival of a population. So they've weaponized the healthcare system to commit the genocide, and I'm not even getting into half of it. The other thing we need to realize as healthcare workers is we can't be silent because occupation is a global health issue, right? There is a geo-socio-political landscape that has enabled the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And that has resulted in the state of apartheid Israel, which has then resulted in medical apartheid, where Palestinians get inferior access to healthcare, and there are significant health inequities between Palestinians and Israelis. For example, the life expectancy of Palestinians are significantly lower than that of Israelis. So the medical apartheid has resulted in serious health consequences for Palestinians. So if you look at the history of apartheid, and this is for South Africans specifically, right? For those of us who remember what apartheid was like, we can see the parallels between what happened in South Africa and what is currently happening in Israel for the longest time. And we know that the significant factor in dismantling apartheid in South Africa was international pressure. There were voices fighting for us. So we now need to be voices for those who are also suffering under an apartheid state. It's time for us to pay it forward. Furthermore, if we stay silent, what are the implications for future conflicts? Right? There was a popular slogan during apartheid days in South Africa, which was an injury to one is an injury to all. You touch any one of us, you're touching an entire community of South Africans, right? And this is important. It's important to have solidarity in protecting healthcare workers, right? Because quite frankly, if we allow this to happen and remain silent, we could be next if we work in conflict zones, right? Which means we aren't safe. Our profession is not safe. So standing up for health justice in Palestine will send a strong message to all of those in conflict zones. It is our role to fight for health justice for all of these reasons that I've just mentioned. We should not be targeted or harassed in our workplaces for doing our duty. We need to have solidarity amongst healthcare workers to protect the sanctity of healthcare provision in conflict zones and to protect each other from threats and harassment. And unfortunately, as Professor London said in his introduction, this has been happening quite often where people have been targeted and attacked verbally, have lost their jobs, have been threatened to have their jobs lost for speaking out against the atrocities happening in Israel, for speaking out against the health inequities and using the health system as a weapon in a genocide. So I think that should provide a context as to why this particular talk is important. So Dr. Go was one of those who was harassed in his workplace for speaking up about health injustices. And so now we can go ahead and listen to his story. Do you want to come back up or should I? Okay. Yeah, stop sharing. Okay, I think I have. There we go. Okay. Dr. Yipengi, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I'm assuming you can hear me all right. Thank you so much for having me. Okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for that opening presentation. I think it makes my job easier because I feel like you've covered so much of what is important to cover in this context.
Dr.
Yeah.
Yvonne, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, so we can't hear you, so please hold on. We're just trying to sort out some technical issues here.
We can hear him online, Feroza.
Oh, so maybe it's just in the room?
Oh, these three.
Yeah, they should be.
We can hear online, yeah.
Device settings. So where's the speakers? Speakers, the settings.
Okay, we're good to go. Thank you so much and apologies.
Yeah? No, it's all good. Can you hear me in the room now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, so I think that's always the unique challenges of doing a hybrid model, but I think it's really great that there's a group in person in South Africa, and then there's a group online, and I'm joining to you online from the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people in Canada, or so-called Canada. And thank you so much for having me in this space. This is amazing. This is my first speaking engagement, and I think it's really symbolic in a lot of ways because it's I've been invited by my South African public health colleagues. It dawns on me that the importance of solidarity coming from South Africa, a post-apartheid state, and also from my public health colleagues halfway around the world, recognizing my own training and work in public health. And it was exactly that got me burned as well. Through the manifestation of anti-Palestinian racism, through a suspension from my university, and then also it kind of forced my hand with respect to a resignation with the Canadian Medical Association, the organization that represents physicians and medical learners in Canada nationally. I know I don't have that much time. I think I have about 20 minutes. So I thought I would kind of take you a bit on a journey with my own path into how I am standing in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and maybe share a little bit about what I saw in Gaza. My initial work was in Indigenous health to begin with, in the context of so-called Canada, First Nations, Métis, Inuit health, and anti-racism and decolonizing work. And this was because of lessons and learnings that I got and was privileged to bear witness to in Hamilton and Six Nations, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee people. And learning about structural racism in the context of both healthcare, but also the genocide of Indigenous peoples in the context of Canada. This really shook me as my own identity of being Chinese, Canadian, settler, immigrant, someone who's benefited from the system of structural racism and genocide of Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada. And so throughout my life, I had to reckon with this identity, and oftentimes, not fully feeling like I fit into the Canadian context of feeling always like an outsider or a minority. And also, I'm ethnically Chinese, and so both my parents were in China. I was born in China, and when I visit my relatives in China, I also am made to feel like an outsider because of my different cultural and worldview upbringing in the context of Canada and a Western nation. And because of this relationship with privilege, of being Canadian, of growing up in Canada, in large part, and understanding these atrocities that happen locally and globally, there's a duty and obligation to exercise that privilege through allyship or through working as an accomplice in the liberation of people who are structurally oppressed. Unmute myself. I learned about the Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard School of Public Health, and also took a course on global perspectives on racism, poverty, and power by Professor Magda Matache, who's a Roma scholar and studies both structural racism and colonialism and imperialism in different contexts around the world, but also the structural oppression and discrimination that Roma people face. And it's interesting how I learned about the Roma people as well, as I spent 3 weeks in Poland in January last year, studying humanitarian negotiation related to the Belarusian and Polish border and the Ukrainian Polish border, and the racist, discriminatory migration policies and responses in the context of the Ukrainian-Russian war. And it was from that context too, learning further about the struggle for equality for Roma peoples, but also for that of Jewish peoples, recognizing the the Holocaust that took place in Eastern Europe, and the struggle for liberation and self-determination. And it was from that context that I wanted to learn more about these interlinked struggles for equality and for decent basic human rights through systems of settler colonialism, imperialism, structural racism. And it was through that course that I wrote and studied about a system of apartheid and structural oppression in the context of Palestine and how that affects health and life under occupation. And you know, as you've already heard from the opening slides, this did not start October 7th by any means. There was, you know, a system of structural oppression that impeded on the rights and liberties of Palestinians, dating as far back as, you know, not 1878, but with the forced displacement of you know, 3/4 of a billion people or a million people from their traditional homelands in Palestine. And much of whom who are displaced already in the Gaza Strip. And so it was from that context that I also visited Palestine with other students from Harvard, wanting to learn about life under occupation, to bear witness, and reckoning with our own privilege of being able to visit, being able to bear witness, and what an immense privilege that is. I had conversations with my Palestinian friends and colleagues who do not have that privilege out of fear of real retribution and detainment or deportation. And so, you know, that visit to the West Bank, as well as other occupied territories across the West Bank. We didn't have an opportunity to visit Gaza because of safety and security reasons, but you know, as many of you likely know, I returned from Rafah, Gaza, and we spent a little bit of time in Khan Yunis as well, only about a week ago. And I'm really saddened to have not had an opportunity to visit Gaza before the escalation of violence, because so much of it has been destroyed, and the people that have invited us into their homes really wanted to invite us into their true homes, and show us the beauty of what Gaza was before October 7th. I think other things that I wanted to share is you know, what's been helpful for me and where I stand and how I found my voice is recognizing, I think, like my relationship with authority. It's always been to, I think, question and critically think about the role of authority figures, but to challenge it appropriately with a degree of compassion and care and love and respect. And it's from that framing that I think we all should be doing this kind of work in solidarity with Palestinians. And one big thing is, I think, knowing who I am and the values that I hold, knowing what I know to be true and right, and staying steadfast in that is because I know who I am, and because I know what I've learned to be true and right, and to deepen those roots, and to have people around me that maintain those connections and remind me sometimes of who I am, despite sometimes all of the backlash. And final thing about, I think, background too, I'll share that I also worked at the World Health Organization back in 2016. I was also the youth delegate for the World Health Assembly for the Canadian government in 2020. And so these systems are somewhat predictable, but it doesn't mean that we have to allow for the status quo to maintain these systems of power and oppression in predictable ways. We do not have to be complicit ourselves when our institutions and authority figures choose to be or feel as though they are strong-armed into that position. That, I think, brings me to I'll briefly touch on my suspension and touch on my resignation. What I'll say is, I learned very early on from a personal, intimate experience of what anti-Palestinian racism can do to allies. And I think to name it and to shame it and to blame it is really important for our collective work to be able to not only have freedom of speech, but to be able to address atrocities, war crimes, international, human rights abuses in the context of Palestine, but in the context of any conflict or genocide in the world. And so it's very true that we are freer when we're all freer when Palestine is free. As was previously mentioned, what is happening in Palestine can happen anywhere else. And if we allow the international community to get away with condoning what is happening in Palestine, what is happening in Gaza as quote unquote normal or quote unquote tolerable by the international community, then these things such as like targeting of healthcare workers, targeting of healthcare institutions become more or less normal in other contexts. The things that I saw within the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa, I actually sit on faculty council as a resident rep. And this is the highest governing body for the Faculty of Medicine, chaired by the Dean of Medicine. And seeing the things that kind of the rhetoric, the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian rhetoric that took place in these spaces when other student cases were being discussed. There were multiple students at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Medicine that were targeted and faced, really awful allegations similar to myself. To see that kind of rhetoric from so-called colleagues, so-called people that teach and mentor others in medicine was extremely appalling and something that I just could not surround myself with moving forward. We were talking, it's always been framed in this light of professionalism. And I saw nothing professional about the behavior of my colleagues. I shouldn't even call them my colleagues anymore because they I certainly do not see it that way moving forward. And so maybe that's what I'll leave it there for the University of Ottawa. And similarly with the Canadian Medical Association, I was their sole resident board member, and they only have 2 learners on their board, the other being a medical student. And to have that kind of bullying, harassment, intimidation with the lens of anti-Palestinian racism was extremely hurtful. And despite all efforts to kind of find a path forward, they really doubled down in terms of that kind of racism, bias, and discrimination. And I have limited time, resources, energy myself. My patience is not unconditional. There is a limit to my patience. As much as I try to give grace, patience to others, I have to find other ways to do good work for patients and community, and that's what it's always been about from my work in Indigenous health in the context of Canada, and also anti-racism and decolonizing work in the space of healthcare and public health. And it was from finding community, finding well-being through community, that I was able to connect with some really amazing folks in the humanitarian space. I connected with other folks as well, but I think it's important to mention the humanitarian space because that's ultimately how I found myself in Rafah, Gaza last week or so. And just the amazing work that these doctors that I met who are part of organizations called GLIA based in Canada and Humanity Auxilium based in Canada and the United States. It was through these organizations in coordination with the World Health Organization that I went on a medical mission as a volunteer to provide primary health care in Rafah and bring in medical supplies. But ultimately, I think my role there was to bear witness to an ongoing genocide and to continue this work outside of Rafah as I continue to receive updates from colleagues and friends that I made on the ground. A lot of the things that we saw in the primary care centers included infections, respiratory infections, gastrointestinal infections. There's a massive outbreak of hepatitis A, and all because of the food, water, and housing insecurity. With these overlapping public health crises, if we can call them that, is a system of forced starvation and material deprivation that I completely 100% now understand from what I've seen on the ground to be nothing other than the systematic destruction of the Palestinian people in Gaza, in part or in whole. And that is what is being discussed, at the ICJ as a case for genocide. And I also have no other conclusion than this being a genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza. The other things that I saw were severe skin conditions, not only burn wounds, but also domestic burns, because people do not have electricity. People haven't had electricity since October 7th. People are charging their phones with car batteries, and there's really no vehicles because there's no fuel. But the domestic burns that we're seeing happen because people are making fires, heating water with fires through wood that they're finding and selling. And there's significant burn injuries that we're seeing in the primary care clinics because of trying to keep warm or trying to cook or warm water. There were no antibiotics at the primary care. We primarily worked out of 2 primary care centers based in Rafah, and there were no antibiotics until we brought some, and I'm worried that the supply that we brought only would probably last only a couple of weeks. Thankfully, we have another delegation that went in just as we were exiting. We're trying to maintain some kind of continuity, at least within our delegation, through these organizations that I mentioned, so that there's some kind of continuity of care and continuous supply of medicines and supplies. But ultimately, what we need is those humanitarian aid trucks to enter unrestricted, because it's just a drop in the ocean with respect to what we can bring in as individuals. We brought in about 18 suitcases amongst the 4 of us within this delegation. And my understanding is the next delegation that went in brought in 50 suitcases. So we're working on doing what we can as individuals to bring in what we can and what we know to be the needs on the ground through talking to pharmacists and the doctors and people. But ultimately, that's still a drop in the ocean with respect to what the actual needs are. We also visited other hospitals in Khan Yunis as well, learning about the patients admitted to the ICU and hospital and what those conditions are, including traumatic injuries such as shrapnel injuries, burns, gunshot wounds, and multiple amputations. These are horrific injuries that are completely unimaginable, I think, to the rest of us, and to simply bear witness to it, I think just there's no way I can ever comprehend being in such a situation, because these are people who have lost their entire families, sometimes sole survivors, children now who are orphaned because they lost their parents, and many of whom or all of whom I've met were civilians, children that were attending school and their school was attacked, or sleeping at night at 1 or 2 a.m. and their building, their home was hit by an airstrike. So just completely unimaginable, I think, for many of us in this world. And yet there is amazing resiliency, perseverance, and joy. The kids that I met, because all the kids are not in school now, the kids that I met who visited the primary care center would always greet me with a smile. Actually, most people that I met would always wave and smile and greet me with such compassion, joy, and grace. Is just completely unbelievable given what they've gone through and continue to go through. And the number of times that I saw kids, sometimes accompanied by adults, flying kites was a beautiful thing to see, as I recall Rifat's poem about the kite. I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I will share that I think there is no like humanitarian solution to what's happening. And it's not a war, it's a genocide with what I've seen with my own eyes. We need an end to the violence through, a permanent, lasting ceasefire, and one that also recognizes the need for unrestricted humanitarian aid to enter the territory. The there's an excellent open letter that went out with a healthcare framing. If you haven't already seen it, please check it out. It was, my understanding, has been created and drafted by some of the colleagues on the line here, or at least in large part pushed forward by them. I think it's a really important lens to recognize how, as healthcare workers, we have a specific, and those in public health have a specific role to play in calling out apartheid, calling out occupation, because these are structural determinants of health. If we, my work has always been in health equity and social determinants of health. And when we talk about determinants of health, we need to look at those broader determinants of colonialism. And in the context of Palestine, that is settler colonialism from the national ideology that is Zionism. And we need to address these root causes face on, otherwise we are incomplete in our own analysis as healthcare researchers or professionals in what are the root causes of disease and suffering in the context of occupied Palestine. And we need to stand with our healthcare workers and call out the targeting of hospitals and healthcare workers. My team, even the days leading up to our entry, we were tasked with going to Nasser Hospital, and that changed. And over the week, we know what happened there. And there's so many healthcare workers, over 70, that have been detained and arrested and likely tortured in unimaginable ways right now. And we need to have all our attention on having those healthcare workers be freed, but also, an end to this kind of targeting that we know to have happened time and time again, but it doesn't mean this cycle has to continue on. We do not have to accept this as a reality. There's important boycott work that, as healthcare workers, we can do, and I'm glad to see that has made its way into the letter. We need to fund UNRWA. We need to denounce anti-Palestinian racism when we see it and we know of it. We need an arms embargo, and in Canada, we're trying to push that as well. But I think we also really need to foster and to build community well-being. We can't do organizing work. We can't do the work of solidarity on our own. And probably all of you already know this. But what I really found benefit in my own experiences is building community, finding community, leaning on those supports and not doing anything alone. And we have to co-create the spaces sometimes to serve as the alternatives, knowing that the institutions and the structural powers at play were never meant for the people who are oppressed or marginalized. These systems were never broken. They were made this way. So sometimes we do have to recreate our own systems from the outside. But sometimes there are people that do good work from the inside to try to change these systems from the inside. Ultimately, I do not have a good answer because I've tried my best to change things from the inside. And over the past couple of months, or in November, I really realized that that was very limited in terms of what I could do. And ultimately, we need an end to the occupation. We need an end to the blockade on Gaza. These are very structural components and systemic components to why Palestinian health and basic human rights and dignities are not afforded to them in the same way. for so many others in this world. We need a pathway to self-determination and liberation, and through that, needing truth-telling and reconciliation and reparations. But before even getting to such a thing, we need to be able to talk. And we can't talk if there is silencing and there is attempts to discredit, dehumanize people who stand in solidarity with Palestine, including Palestinians. And you know, I will also say that I appreciate the opportunity to share my perspectives and narratives in the context of organizing and mobilizing and solidarity work for Palestine. But my voice should never overshadow or overtake the voices of Palestinians that are most affected. The work moving forward needs to be always centered around Palestinians that are most affected by the impacts of structural racism and colonialism. I think about a common quote that is shared in the Indigenous health space in Canada, that it is nothing about us without us. The work that I've done in the context of so-called Canada Indigenous health has always been Indigenous-led and driven by the needs of community. And the pathway forward here needs to be Palestinian-led and driven by the community's needs as well. So I think what I also will leave you with is how will you, I think, exercise leadership, and how will you use the power that you have? I think a big part of what I realized over the past couple of months since November is realizing that I had a voice that I didn't even realize that I had. I didn't realize the power that I have as an individual. I didn't ask for any of this to unfold in the way that it did, but you know, in November, I think I was really much like reacting to what was coming at me, and then trying my best to mindfully respond as time went on. I think there are ways in which we can all chart a path forward for ourselves that maintains who we are as people, our own identity, as a place of self-preservation, but self-preservation can be fully aligned with solidarity work for a free Palestine. I think there would have been ways that I could have compromised throughout the past couple of months that wouldn't have stayed true to who I am, and would have been really harmful for a movement for a free Palestine. And so I hope you all can reflect and also help others reflect, because I don't know where all of you are in terms of your own journey related to anti-racism or related to your work in helping with what's happening in Palestine. But I'll leave you with a quote called by Clementine Paddleford. It was shared to me also by another, they are non-Indigenous, but was shared to me by an Indigenous leader in Canada, is that you should never grow a wishbone where your backbone ought to be. And so I think there's a role for each one of us to recognize where our backbones are, where our lines can be drawn in relation to Palestine, but in relation to any injustice or atrocity that we see in the world, and framing it once again from a place of care, compassion, and love for our shared and collective humanity, so that never again really means never again for any peoples in this world. I would be remiss to not also mention Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. He was a public health physician in Canada who spoke up about the poor health and sanitation conditions in residential schools. That was a system to remove Indigenous children, primarily First Nations children, from their families, and also systematically killed them and buried them on the grounds of residential schools. Once again, a manifestation of the genocide of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And this was in 1907, and he, as a public health physician and a physician, called this out and was ostracized by the medical community and was pretty much pushed aside. And now, many years later, is being honored for his work to draw attention to the root causes of disease and suffering. And so I hope more and more people acknowledge what we need to do as a bare minimum is that when an active genocide is unfolding, we must call it out. And this extends beyond just Palestine as well, recognizing that there are other genocides and conflicts where children and innocent civilians are made most vulnerable and suffer the greatest consequences, for example, in Sudan or in Congo. And there's great analyses as to why they're not getting the same attention, probably because of structural racism, that of anti-Black racism in the overall global context, for normalizing things like violence or poverty or suffering for Black people around the world or for Black people in the continent of Africa. So we need to push back on these narratives, and we have to recognize how they're interconnected. And only then can we be better allies and supporters for a free Palestine as well. Thank you.